The crane screamed before it fell. That was the sound Corporal Darian Tessier remembered years later. Not the crash, not the shouting, not the radio chatter that followed. Just that high metallic scream of steel cable pulling past its limit. A sound like the earth itself was tearing open. He was standing 40 feet away when the load shifted, and he remembers thinking, with strange calm, this is going to be very bad. It was. The logging crane, a 60-ton beast the Army Corps of Engineers had borrowed from a forestry operation outside Petawawa, had been tasked with clearing a collapsed bridge section over the Bonnechere River. The operation was part of a flood recovery exercise, joint training between two combat engineer regiment and civilian emergency services. Everything had been planned down to the minute. There were binders, there were PowerPoint slides. There were 3 different officers who had each independently confirmed the load calculations. And now there was a crane lying on its side in 4 feet of spring meltwater, a section of precast concrete slab pinning its boom to the riverbank, and a CH-147 Chinook inbound with supplies that had nowhere to land because the clearing zone was now a disaster site. Corporal Tessier was 26 years old. He had his engineering ticket, a year at RMC behind him, and exactly 0 experiences that had prepared him for this. His sergeant, a man named Halvorsen, was already on the radio. The site commander, Captain Ford, was walking in fast circles on the gravel bank, talking to someone at headquarters. 2 privates were wading into the shallows trying to assess the crane's undercarriage, which accomplished nothing except getting them wet and cold. The civilian crane operator had climbed out of his cab and was sitting on a rock with his head in his hands. Nobody was doing anything useful. Tessier stood at the waterline and looked at the mess. The crane had fallen upstream left. The boom had caught on the near bank at an angle that was almost lucky, a few degrees different, and it would have taken out the temporary footbridge that was the only crossing point for 6 kilometers in either direction. The concrete slab, a 2-ton section of the old bridge deck, had come down on top of the boom and was now sitting in about 18 inches of fast-moving water. The crane's hook assembly was still attached to a rigging chain that disappeared into the murk at an angle that suggested it was caught on something underneath. The problem was layered. The crane couldn't be righted without removing the slab. The slab couldn't be moved without rigging equipment. The rigging equipment was on the crane, and the hook was snagged on something underwater that nobody had yet been able to identify, which meant that if they tried to rig a recovery without knowing what was down there, they could make the whole situation significantly worse. The Chinook called in on the radio, 15 minutes out. "We need that LZ cleared," Captain Ford said, appearing at Tessier's elbow. "Yes, sir." "What's the status?" Tessier looked at the crane. He looked at the river. He looked at the concrete slab sitting in the water like it had always been there. "Working on it, sir." Ford walked away to make another radio call. That was when Tessier noticed the old man. He was standing about 30 meters upstream at the bend where the gravel bank gave way to a flat shelf of exposed shale. He was wearing a canvas work jacket, the color of creek mud, the kind with the flannel lining that you could find at any Canadian tire in the country, and he had a thermos in one hand and a look on his face that Tessier could not quite read. Not alarm. Not the rubbernecking curiosity of a civilian who'd wandered in to watch the show. Something more settled than that, appraising. He looked to be somewhere north of 70. His face had the deeply lined, squared-off quality of someone who had spent decades outdoors in all weather. His hands, wrapped around the thermos, were large and scarred in the way that hands get scarred from real work. Not gym calluses, not keyboard roughness, but the accumulated record of metal and machinery and cold. Tessier had no idea how the man had gotten onto the site. They'd cordoned off the bank road with pylons and tape. He should not have been here. "Sir," Tessier called, "this is a restricted area. I'm going to have to ask you to move back behind the tape." The old man looked at him with eyes the color of the river. He didn't move. "How long's she been down?" he asked. His accent was faintly Northern Ontario, the vowels flattened and unhurried. "Sir, I need you to the crane," the man said. "How long?" Tessier checked his watch. 40 minutes. The old man nodded slowly, like this was information he was filing somewhere. He looked at the slab. He looked at the angle of the boom. He looked at the rigging chain going into the water. He took a sip from his thermos. "Your hook's caught on the old culvert grate," he said. "There's a storm culvert runs under the bank, about 2 meters upstream of where she went in. Grate's been there since the 70s. Comes loose in flood season and drifts. Hook went through it on the way down. Tessia stared at him. How do you know that? Grew up on this river, the man said. Name's Aldous Hearn. He said it the way people say their name when they don't expect it to mean anything to you, matter-of-factly, without the pause that people leave when they want recognition, just a name. Corporal Tessia, Tessia said, because it seemed rude not to. What's your plan, Corporal? Tessia glanced back at Captain Ford, who was still on the radio. Then he looked at the crane again, and at the slab, and at the chain going into the water. Still working that out? Aldous Hearn said nothing for a moment. He looked at the slab. He looked at the angle of the boom again, this time more carefully, his head tilting slightly like a bird's. Then he said very quietly, almost to himself, "You could float her. I'm sorry. The slab." He pointed with the thermos. "She's sitting in 18 inches of water on a gravel bottom. Not embedded. Not under load, cranes not putting pressure on her from above, the booms resting on the bank behind the slab, not on top of it. You've got maybe 200 kilos of net weight in the water, rest is displaced. Rig a couple of airbags under her, she'll lift clean." Tessia looked at the slab. He looked at Aldous Hearn. "We don't have airbags on site. You've got a compressor, though." Tessia looked at the equipment staged on the high ground. There was indeed a trailer-mounted air compressor brought in for the pneumatic tools they'd been using on the bridge work. "We have a compressor. And you've got tarps." Tessia was quiet for a moment. He could see where this was going, and something in his engineering brain was running calculations that were not entirely discouraging. Heavy-duty tarps, sealed with clamps or rope, fed with compressed air, would give you a crude but functional lifting bladder. It was not sophisticated. It was not anything he'd been taught at RMC. But it was not obviously wrong either. "If we get the slab clear," Aldous continued, "your boom's free. Crane's still on her side, but she's righted easier than you think. There's a recovery point on that model on the left rear frame rail. You run a snatch block from it to that spruce." He nodded toward a large spruce growing at the top of the bank. "And you've got mechanical advantage enough to walk her up." Tessia stared at him. "What model of crane is that?" "Lever LTM, early 2000s from the look of her," Aldous said. 35-ton capacity, maybe 60 if she's the extended boom variant. That hook assembly's a 6-part line, which means she's rigged for the heavy end." He paused. "Am I right?" Tessia turned and looked at the crane's nameplate, still visible above the waterline. He walked close enough to read it. He walked back. "LTM 1055, he said. Aldous nodded. 55-ton, recovery points on the left rear. You'll see a recessed lug with a yellow stripe." There was a long pause. Behind them, Tessia could hear the captain's voice on the radio, tight and controlled in the way that voices get when they are trying to sound in control and are not. The two privates were still wading around uselessly in the shallows. Sergeant Halvorson had found a clipboard and was writing on it, which was either documentation or displacement behavior, and Tessia suspected the latter. "You've done crane recovery before," Tessia said. "It wasn't quite a question." "Here and there," Aldous said. "Here and there." Tessia looked at the man's hands, at the set of his shoulders, at the way he stood on the bank, weight forward, easy, like a man who had spent a lot of his life standing on unsteady ground and had made his peace with it. "Where'd you serve?" Tessia asked. Aldous looked at him sideways. The corner of his mouth moved barely. "Long time ago," he said. That was all. Tessia turned and walked up the bank to where Captain Ford had finally fished his radio call. "Sir, I have an approach." Ford listened. His expression went through several phases as Tessia described the tarp bladder idea, starting with skepticism, moving through something close to disbelief, and arriving at a complicated place that was not quite either. "Who is that man?" he asked, looking past Tessia at Aldous Hearn. "Local, sir. Says he knows the river. He identified the hang-up point on the hook, the culvert grate. I think he's right, he thinks." Ford's voice had an edge. "He thinks. Corporal, I have a Chinook 15 minutes out. I have brigade calling me every 4 minutes, and you want to take recovery advice from a civilian in a Canadian tire jacket who wandered onto my site." "Yes, sir." Ford stared at him. Then he looked at the crane. Then he looked at the clipboard Halvorson was holding. "What else do we have?" "Nothing faster, sir." Another long pause. The river moved past them, fast and cold and indifferent. "Get Halvorson to help you," Ford said. "I want that slab clear in 20 minutes. It took 23. Not because the approach was wrong, but because the first tarp they tried had a seam failure under pressure and lost air immediately. Private Wickfield, who was 20 years old and from Timmins and had grown up ice fishing, suggested folding a second tarp over the first and tying off the leading edge rather than trying to seal it, essentially making a sleeve. And this worked well enough that they had both bladders inflated and the slab rocking in the water inside of 8 minutes after the first failure. Aldous Hearn stood on the bank the whole time. He didn't interfere. When Tessier looked at him, he was watching with that same level, appraising expression, occasionally sipping from his thermos. Once, when Wickfield's sleeve fold started to slip, Aldous said quietly, "Tie it to the grate below." "Use the grate!" Tessier passed the instruction down. Wickfield tied off to the grate. It held. The slab broke the surface at an angle, swinging slowly in the current, buoyant and strange. They rigged a line from the sights come along to the slab's rebar stub and drew it away from the boom. It caught briefly on the river bottom, then came free with a sound like a boot pulled from deep mud. That hollow sucking pop. The boom was free. Tessier stood in ankle-deep water, with mud on his uniform to the knee, and looked at what they had left. The crane was still on its side, its undercarriage facing the far bank, its cab half submerged. The hook assembly had come up automatically when the great tension released, thank God, which meant the winch hadn't been fouled. Now it was just a machine on its side, which was vastly simpler than a machine on its side, with a concrete slab on top and a hook caught on a buried culvert grate. He walked back to where Aldous was standing. "The recovery point," Tessier said. "Show me." Aldous walked to the edge of the bank and crouched down with the ease of a man who still had good knees, which surprised Tessier, though he wasn't sure why. He pointed. On the left rear frame rail of the crane, just above the waterline, there was a recessed lug fitting with a yellow stripe on it, exactly as described. "There," Aldous said. Tessier crouched beside him and looked. "What's the load rating on that lug? Should be stamped on the rail beside it. You'll need to get closer." Private Keller waded in to read it. 80 kilonewtons, Corporal." Tessier ran the numbers into his head. Crane on its side, partial submersion, reducing effective weight by maybe 30%. Good ground anchor on the spruce, the numbers worked. Not with huge margin, but they worked. "Single snatch block," Aldous said. "Don't go two. One's enough and two complicates your geometry." "From the compressor," Tessier said. "We can use the drive belt as a—" "No," Aldous said, and his voice was gentle but absolute. "The way you'd correct a child who was about to touch a hot element. Drive belt'll slip under load. You've got a hand winch on the equipment trailer. Use that." Tessier turned and looked at the equipment trailer. There was indeed a hand winch mounted to the frame, the kind that most people never touched because there was always a powered option. He had walked past it 4 times this morning. "Right," he said quietly. "They rigged it in 11 minutes. Sergeant Halvorson ran the line while Tessier managed the snatch block at the spruce. The pull angle was not ideal. They were working slightly across the crane's centre of gravity rather than directly against it, but Aldous had anticipated this and told them to put a check line on the cab side run to a secondary anchor at a drainage culvert upslope to keep her from rolling past centre when she came up. Captain Ford stood on the high ground and watched. He had stopped making radio calls. They started the winch. At first nothing happened. The line went taut, the spruce groaned, and the crane sat on its side with the absolute indifference of 60 tons of steel that does not particularly feel like moving. Tessier heard Private Wickfield, who was managing the check line, mutter something under his breath that he chose not to hear. Then there was a sound. Not dramatic, not the screaming cable sound from the beginning, but a deep, slow creak. The sound of something very heavy acknowledging that it might be negotiable. The crane shifted. Not up, not yet, but a settling movement, the machine finding its relationship with the pull force, locating the argument. Then it began to rise. It came up slowly the way a large animal rights itself, with dignity and reluctance, finding its balance 1 degree at a time. The check line came taut as it approached vertical. The cab broke the surface, water sheeting off it in the April sun. The tracks found purchase on the gravel bottom. The machine shuddered, found its feet, and stood. Private Keller started clapping. Nobody else did immediately, but after a moment Wickfield joined in, and then Halvorson, and Tessier found himself exhaling something he hadn't known he'd been holding. He turned to look at Aldous Hearn. The old man was already walking away. Not hurrying, he never seemed to hurry, but walking steadily back up the bank toward the bend in the river where Tessier had first seen him. "Mr. Hearn," Tessier called. Aldous stopped and turned. Tessier walked up to him. He was not entirely sure what he meant to say. "Thank you" seemed insufficient. "Where did you learn this seemed too nosy? Who are you seemed too much. He settled for, we wouldn't have gotten there without you. Aldous looked at him for a moment. His expression was not quite a smile, but there was something in it, something quiet and without bitterness. The look of a man who was used to being invisible and had made his peace with that too. You'd have gotten there, Aldous said. Just would have taken you longer. The culvert grate, Tessier said. If we hadn't known the hook was caught, you'd have figured it out, might have lost another hour. He paused. Time matters, though. Yes, Tessier said. It does. There was a moment between them that Tessier did not know how to classify. Not camaraderie exactly. They were not the same generation or the same world. Not quite mentorship. Something closer to recognition. The thing that passes between people who both understand, each in their own way, what it costs to hold things together under pressure. Where did you serve? Tessier asked again. Aldous looked at the river. The water was running high and fast, still carrying the grey weight of meltwater from upstream. It would be running like this for another 2 weeks, maybe 3, and then the gravel bars would start to show again and the river would become itself again. Cyprus, he said finally, then Golan. Couple of other places they didn't always put on the news. Tessier knew enough to know what that meant. Canadian peacekeeping operations in the 70s and early 80s. Yuns. UNDOF. Operations that weren't combat, exactly, but weren't safe either, and that people of a certain generation had come back from carrying things they had rarely found the right occasion to set down. Royal Canadian Engineers? Tessier asked. Aldous shook his head. He said, repair and recovery. 40 years I spent fixing things people broke in hard places. He paused, and some things they didn't break, just got stuck. He said this without emphasis, but Tessier heard it. The tarp bladder, Tessier said. That was, he stopped. He didn't have the word. 1978, Aldous said. Bridge section went down over an irrigation canal outside of Nicosia. We had a UN observer vehicle on the wrong side, medical supplies that needed to cross, and exactly nothing on hand that any manual would have approved of. He took a sip from his thermos. My warrant officer at the time, man named Babcock, Gordon Babcock. He looked at the situation for about 4 minutes and said, the water will float what we need it to float if we ask it right. He paused. Babcock didn't have a formal engineering education. He'd grown up running boats on Lake Nipigon, but he knew what water would do. Tessier thought about this, and you've been asking it right ever since. Aldous looked at him sideways again. The corner of his mouth moved the same way it had before. Most of the time, he said. Behind them the Chinook was coming in now. Tessier could hear it, the heavy rhythmic chop-chop-chop of the rotors as it set up its approach to the clearing that was now, thanks to 33 minutes of improvised recovery work, actually clear. He heard Captain Ford issuing instructions to the landing party. He heard the equipment trailer's wheels on the gravel as Halverson began staging recovery gear. He should go. There was work to do, and the day was not over. Mr. Hearn, he said, if you'll give me your contact information, I think my captain would want to. No need, Aldous said pleasantly. There might be a commendation. No need for that either. Not rude, not dismissive, just clear. Tessier looked at him for a moment. Is there anything? There's one thing, Aldous said. Tessier waited. That spruce anchor. Aldous nodded toward the tree at the top of the bank. She held today, but she's got root damage on the downslope side, probably from the flood 2 years ago. You can see the heaving in the soil about a metre out from the trunk. He paused. Another big pull load on her, and she'll likely let go. Worth noting. Tessier turned and looked at the spruce. He looked at the soil around the base. He could see, now that he was looking, the slight unevenness of the ground that Aldous was describing, the subtle swelling that indicated disturbed root structure. He turned back. I'll put it in my report, he said. Aldous nodded. Good. He recapped his thermos. That's all I needed. And he walked away, unhurried, up the shale shelf along the gravel margin of the Bonnechere, growing smaller against the tree line. Tessier watched him go. He watched until the canvas jacket disappeared around the curve of the river, and for a moment the bank was just the bank. Water, stone, spruce, April sky. Then Ford was beside him. Good work, Corporal. Thank you, sir. Tessier hesitated. The local man, I saw. Ford was quiet for a moment, looking at the spot where Aldous had been. Then he said, He said so, sir. Ford was quiet a moment longer. He had served himself for 12 years, and before that his father had served, and his father before him, and he knew the shape of certain men the way you know a landmark you've driven past many times. Good people, he said. The recovery trades. Underestimated. Yes, sir. The Chinook came down in a wash of rotor noise and displaced air, settling onto the gravel clearing. The crew began moving immediately, efficient and practiced. Tessier walked back to his crew. There were equipment checks to run, a crane to fully assess, a report to file that was going to take several careful hours if he was going to do it honestly. He had things to learn, several of which he had not known this morning that he needed to learn. He added them silently to the running list he kept. That night, back at the forward operating base, he looked up RCEME operations in Cyprus between 1974 and 1982. He found unit records, deployment logs, the names of operations that had not, as Aldous had said, always made the news. He found references to a recovery incident near Nicosia in July 1978, a UN vehicle recovery operation that had required improvised techniques due to equipment limitations. It was described in the unit diary in 3 lines, the language dry and bureaucratic, as these things always were. The name in the relevant entries was a warrant officer, 3rd Class G.W. Babcock. There was no mention of anyone named Hearn, which, Tessier thought, was probably exactly how Aldous Hearn would have wanted it. He closed his laptop and looked out the window of the hut at the April dark. Somewhere out there the Bonnechere was still running, fast and cold, carrying its meltwater south. Somewhere along its bank there was a man in a canvas jacket and worn work boots who knew what water would do if you asked it right, and who had seen 50 years of hard places, and who had walked onto a chaotic riverbank that morning and seen the problem clearly within 90 seconds, and who had said float her as though it were obvious, because to him it was, because experience doesn't expire. That's the thing about it, the thing that younger people sometimes forget and older ones know in their bones. A 60-year-old lesson, pulled from a canal outside of Nicosia in the summer of 1978, had spent 46 years waiting for the right question. And that morning, on a gravel bank on the Bonnechere, the question came, and the lesson answered. There are people in this country, in the trades, in the uniform, in the quiet corners of communities from Petawawa to Prince George, who are carrying that kind of knowledge. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't put itself on LinkedIn. It wears a Canadian tire jacket and drinks from a thermos and watches from a respectful distance until someone is in real trouble, and then it says quietly, "You could float her." Tessier wrote his report. He noted the spruce tree's root damage. He credited Warrant Officer G.W. Babcock, deceased as it turned out in 1994, buried in Nipigon, for the improvised bladder technique, sourcing it through the 1978 unit diary. He did not name Aldous Hearn in the report. He had no address, no service number, no unit affiliation to cite. But at the bottom of the incident summary, in the section marked Notes and Recommendations, he wrote one additional line. Local knowledge and experienced informal consultation proved instrumental in expediting site recovery. Recommend development of a formal protocol for engaging retired trades personnel in complex field recovery operations. It was, he knew, a very small thing, the kind of line that gets read once and filed and probably never acted on. But it was there, it was on the record. And somewhere on the river, Aldous Hearn went home, put his thermos on the kitchen counter, hung up his jacket, and made himself a late lunch without telling anyone what had happened that morning, because that was not the kind of man he was. The kind of man he was had fixed things in hard places for 40 years and asked for nothing, and kept going. And if you know someone like that, someone older, quieter, with hands like that and eyes like that, and the kind of patience that only comes from having seen things go wrong before, and knowing they can be made right, then you know what Darien Tessier knew, standing on that bank watching the canvas jacket disappear around the river bend. You don't fully understand what you're seeing until it's already gone.